Good evening, guys, and welcome to Advanced Refrigeration Podcast. You're here with your hosts, Brett Wetzel and Kevin Compass. What's going on this week?
Oh, nothing much. Just kind of trying to get some startups started and trimming out a bunch of wires at a new target and downtown, just kind of trying to get everything trimmed out, and then starting to prep up for big compressor change. Got like 25 plus compressors to change at the store. So they're doing a retrofit from Copeland scrolls to bits or recips. So I'm going to pre-prep them all up before we send them on down, and hopefully makes the job a little easier. What about you?
I was working with a kid today. We were doing, I was there for a PM, and then I ended up finding issues. I was just talking to the gentleman at the facility and was asking what was going on. And he said he's having some oil issues with one of the racks. So I started checking it out and finding out that, basically it looked like the float was stuck open. There was that much oil just flowing through into the reservoir, and it was filling up and going out the top of the OCV. So I adjusted all the oil levels and got them down to where they needed to be, and ended up changing out the OCV for 10 to 20 because the suction pressure, there was no way to really stabilize it out. And while I was changing out the OCV, I was talking to the kid and basically, he was asking questions while I was doing something. So my brain started going. I got preoccupied with what I was doing, opened up a valve that I probably shouldn't have, and I had an oil geyser just shoot out. I just wasn't paying attention. And you think the kid would grab, a rag, a wrench, a cap, maybe. No, the little son of a bitch just goes away and starts recording on his phone. And I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, put it down. And then he grabs the freaking thing and here's the rag. I'm like, thanks. A little bit too late, brother.
I'd have done the same thing to you.
It was the first time I think I've gotten an oil bath in probably about 10 years. So, I guess I was due. It wasn't really a bath. It was more just a shower. It just shot up straight up to the ceiling and just started trickling down. So what do we got going on tonight? What are we doing?
So we're going to go over transcritical CO2. We're going to do it in like two parts. Do the first part, kind of going over the system type stuff. Then the next part, we're going to go over some more advanced stuff and troubleshooting and some commissioning type stuff. So I'll take the lead since we got a little bit more transcritical racks in Chicagoland than you guys do out in Texas. Do you guys even have any out there?
No. I think the only transcritical rack that I think I've seen here is up in Oklahoma. I've worked on one or two up in when I was up in Connecticut, but that was years ago, like 6 years ago, something like that. Because obviously it's a cooler climate, but yeah, here, Texas, negative.
Yeah. So, as these things get more and more efficient, you're going to start seeing them get, creep more down. I know there's Aldis in Texas that are transcritical. There's at least a handful of them. So, they're going gangbusters with it, but as like technology, gets a little better, you're going to start seeing them more. So we're going to go into the transcritical rack. So now in transcritical, we went over the Cascade rack earlier. The Cascade rack still had an HFC or HCFC cooling down the low temp CO2 compressors. Now we have a straight DX CO2 rack. So we have, we're taking the CO2 and we have to deal with a lot of things now. We have to lower the pressure. We have to deal with it running transcritical, because above 87 degrees, we're going to be in transcritical, meaning that we're no longer a vapor, a solid, a liquid. It's an unstable gas, an unchartable gas. So what is going to happen is we need to bring that liquid deck down to a stable state. So we could use it and get a good net refrigeration effect out of it. Because if we just use it as high pressure and we kept it at above the 87-degree mark, we're going to be extremely inefficient. We're going to have a ton of flash gas going through the metering device. Metering devices would need to be way bigger. Compressors would need to be bigger. Everything would be less efficient, and it wouldn't make sense to use it as a HFC or HCFC. So below that 87-degree mark, CO2 is way more efficient than 448, 404. I mean, above that 87-degree mark, you're going to lose your efficiency. Now, all these charts they have, I mean, they're kind of like fibbed a little bit. I mean, they say you may only be running transcritical. Like, I think Chicago has like 30 or 40 days. I mean, it's more than that. It's like 60 to 90 days. I mean, it's basically all summer you're going to be running transcritical. Anytime your saturation temperature is above 87 degrees. So you figure if you have a 10-degree TD on a condenser, I mean, if you're running 77 degrees outside, you're probably going to be running transcritical at that point. You're going to be at that 87 mark. Go ahead, Brett.
So what the I know normally they use the adiabatic. It's not even actually called a condenser at that point. It's actually called a gas cooler on most of the prints, because it's not being able to change that refrigerant, into a solid stream of liquid all year round. What's the TD typically on something like that in a climate in Chicago?
So we only have a couple stores that are adiabatic. Most of our stuff are just straight gas coolers, or like a standard condenser, basically. I've seen TDs on prints as low as 5, and I've seen them as high as 12. So we only have one adiabatic store, and it's like, I think it was like 8 was the design TD. But as well as I do, that all depends on the load in the rack. I mean, your TD can vary. I mean, if you have a rack size for, X amount of horsepower and you're only running half that, your TD is going to be way lower. So some of these programs take that into, like Microthermal will take that into account, and it'll actually float the TD differently. So at 87 degrees, though, this is where we get a little bit different. At 87-degree drop leg temperature. Now, they're not doing saturation. They're doing drop leg temperature. So they're controlling your fans off drop leg temp. At 87 degrees, you run full bore fans. So they're just trying to de-superheat as much as possible. So we're going to take this, the way I start doing this, there's booster DX CO2 racks, and there is just straight up medium temp CO2 racks. So I'm going to go into what a booster is. A booster is taking a low stage compressor, and you're discharging the discharge of that compressor into a high stage compressor, meaning like a medium temp compressor or a high temp compressor. So what you're doing is you're taking your compression ratio. So say like we're running 200 pounds on our suction and we're running 450 on our discharge. Now, that's a pretty low compression ratio. This is where CO2 gets efficient. That's a really low compression ratio. It doesn't sound like it, but it is. When you take 200 or 400, that's really low compared to like 448 or 449. Now, if you were to take 200 pounds and bump it up to 1,400 pounds straight transcritical pressures, like in the middle of summer, that would be an insane compression ratio, and you would lose all efficiencies, and CO2 would not be an efficient refrigerant to run. So what we do is, in this booster application, we discharge from the low temp compressors into the medium temp suction. So now that medium temp suction is compressing the gas up and then discharging it to 1,200 pounds. So now we're going from 400, 450 to, anywhere from 600 to 1,500 pounds, depending on the application. So that way you gain this efficiency with this lower compression ratio and a low temp, and you have less of a compression ratio on a medium temp. So we're stepping up the pressure. So that way we aren't losing all of our efficiency. So that allows you to run smaller compressors in a low temp because you would need a way bigger compressor. I mean, some of these stores, the low temp compressors are insanely small. I'm talking like they look like K-body Copelands, like little Bitzers. Like I could pick it up with like one hand. I mean, they're just little tiny baby compressors. Some of them are running scrolls, 410A scrolls for the low stage. Because you're running 410A pressures, basically. You're running a higher suction saturation pressure, but like your discharge pressure is right in line with 410A. So on the low temp. Now, depending on the rack manufacturer, they all do it differently. How they're going to deal with this low temp compressor discharging into medium temp. So you could do it with a desuperheating valve because you're going to have warm discharge gas going to your medium temp compressors. So you have to cool that gas back down. So you could do liquid injection into the header. Hill Phoenix does that a lot. They do liquid injection and they inject liquid in the header to desuperheat it. So that way you have cool gas come back to your medium temp compressors. Other manufacturers use oh man, I always mess this up. They use a vessel, and right, you're gonna know what it is in a second. You're gonna, if you think of the name, they use it in ammonia a lot. They use it's a recirculated vessel.
I'm trying to think of. I don't know. I've never seen. The only thing that I'm thinking of, because they obviously can't use DTC valves for the liquid injection, right? So it's basically all done with solenoids, yeah.
Yeah, it's solenoids, and then they're using some manufacturers use a heat exchanger. They'll take a heat exchanger and they'll run discharge gas through for the low temp through it, and they'll run vapor coming back from the low temp suction, and they'll keep that, and they'll use that to desuperheat it sometimes to protect the low temp compressors, and then they'll use an accumulator with I can't believe I'm losing the name here. A what?
Shell and tube?
Not a shell and tube. They'll use an accumulator basically, and they'll keep a level of liquid in it, and they'll discharge the compressors into the accumulator, and that accumulator basically is cooling off the discharge gas, and at the same time keeping the medium temp suction from getting flooded out.
Okay.
So, I mean, this is. Yeah, it's like running a flooded evaporator ammonia.
I gotcha. And then basically any refrigerant that's boiled off in this accumulator basically is going to rise to the top, which then is going to get sucked into the medium temp side of the CO2 compressors, yeah?
Correct. And then out of the bottom of the accumulator is low temp liquid going out to the store, because they're flooding. Say they keep the accumulator like 20% liquid, and they'll draw off the bottom of the accumulator because it's going to be at 450 pounds, and it's going to go to the low temp suction or low temp liquid feeding low temp stuff. Now that is only one manufacturer, and they're the only manufacturer I've ever seen do that. That's Carnot, the way they kind of do it under temp racks. Now Hill Phoenix, Kaiser Warren, Hussmann, I've also pretty much done the same thing. They've just discharged low temp compressors in the medium temp accumulator or into the suction, and they use liquid injection to desuperheat it. So good.
What superheat are they looking for on those compressors? Obviously, most compressors, dig anything, greater than 20 degrees. What's usually the set point on those controllers? If the set point gets up to 40, does it start feeding? 30? What is it trying to maintain?
Like 30 to 35 degrees of superheat. When you start getting to like 15, Hill Phoenix and Kaiser are using hot gas injection to control the superheat. So they're taking hot gas from the TC side, the transcritical side, and they're injecting hot gas into the medium temp suction header to try to kind of control superheat. Because here's the problem. You don't want to see, anytime that superheat starts dropping to like 10 degrees, you start getting CO2 mixing with the oil, and it starts pumping the oil out rapidly. I mean, you could pretty much, if you graph and the suction's getting low, and you could pretty much see your way and your oil problem starting. So like, that's why suction temperature control critical with CO2. You really got to keep those superheats up. I mean, I like to see them like 25 to 30 on CO2. I like to run them a lot lower on HFCs and HCFCs, but on CO2, you want to keep that superheat a little bit higher, so that way you keep your oil from getting washed away, because that's where most of these oil problems start, is from liquid picking up liquid CO2 picking up the oil, and it just washes it away. I mean, I've seen it wipe out a compressor in like less than 15 seconds, just wash all the oil out of it. Wow. And you're talking like 5 degrees of superheat still. It just mixes, and the little droplets of liquid just mix real good with the liquid CO2 or with the oil, and just washes it away. So now that we've discharged out of our low temp compressors into our medium temp, and now we're at our medium temp suction. So you have your discharge from your compressors going in there, and then you also have your caseload coming back. Okay, and then you're going to go out of your compressors, and you're going to go up to your roof, and you're going to go to your gas cooler. The reason we call it a gas cooler is because anytime the condensing temperature is above 87 degrees, you're no longer condensing. You're only cooling off desuperheating vapor. So anytime it's above 87 degree drop leg, fans run 100%, trying to get as much heat out of there as we can. You got to keep them condensers clean. The cleaner you keep the condensers, the better. I mean, anytime they're a little bit dirty and when it's real hot out, you're going to have problems. Fan motors out, bad time. So you want to make sure you keep that all good. Now, when you're below 87 degrees, you're condensing liquid. So you're actually making liquid. Now, here's where it gets tricky. We need to drop that CO2 pressure down to a safe, usable, stable pressure. Okay, we do this 2 ways. So we have to reduce the pressure coming into the receiver, and then we have to control the receiver pressure. So there's a couple ways to do this. We're going to talk about the standard way. You're going to see probably 80 to 90% of these wrecks, you're going to have 2 valves. You're going to have what's called the high pressure valve. Hill Phoenix, for some god-awful reason, somebody named it the magic valve, and there's nothing magic about it. It's just, it is a high pressure valve. It has a couple jobs. So in the wintertime and extremely low ambience, it is a holdback valve. It sets your minimum condensing pressure. So, and then when in the summertime and anytime the receiver pressure is too high, it's holding back, and it's trying to keep the receiver pressure from escalating too high. And then it's trying to maintain a subcooling value leaving the condenser. So typically it is a 3 degree subcooling value. Now, here's the issue. So when we're running transcritical, when we're above 87 degrees, CO2 no longer is on a PT chart. So there is no pressure temperature relationship. So Danfoss has this controller called a 326A. It is probably the most robust controller out there for doing CO2 vessel control. Microthermal has their own now. It's been out a couple. We have like 2 racks with it. Dixel has their own. A couple, Corel makes their own. They all make their own controller for this. Danfoss has this patented control algorithm. They figured out somewhere on this COP chart, coefficient of performance chart, where they think these numbers, these discharge pressure numbers, equal out into saturation temperature, and they are falsely raising and lowering that pressure to most efficiently run that gas cooler and keep a subcooling number on the gas cooler, and also control the receiver pressure. So it's doing this constant opening and closing to keep that subcooling number good and also keep the receiver pressure good. So typically our receiver pressures, we're dropping down anywhere from 500 to 650. It all depends on the store design. It's all going to be on store design, pressure drops, what your medium temp suction is running, because you need anywhere from 55 to 75 pounds of pressure drop on your liquid to your suction to get a good feed on your metering devices. So this whole thing, the way this is set up is, so say your receiver pressure set point is in this 326A controller is 500 pounds. So that valve is going to be, if your pressure gets high in your receiver, that valve is going to start holding back. Okay. Now we have a second valve in this receiver. It's called a flash gas bypass valve. This valve's whole job in life is to control receiver pressure. It doesn't care about anything else but receiver pressure. So when a receiver pressure gets high, the flash gas bypass valve starts opening up. When it's low, it starts closing down. So those two valves are controlled from the same controller. The 326A controller, when the receiver pressure gets high, it starts opening the flash gas bypass valve and closing back the valve. When it's low, it starts doing the opposite. It starts closing the flash gas bypass valve and opening the high pressure valve. The high pressure valve should be pretty steady. It shouldn't be jumping around a lot. I mean, it should be, if it's tuned properly, it should be pretty steady. Depending on the driver, it gets a 0 to 10 volt signal from the 326A controller. And that's how that valve modulates open and close. And then the 326A controller is directly controlling the flash gas bypass valve off the controller. You should see no more than a 5 to 10 pound swing on your receiver pressure. Every single rack I've started up with the OEM settings has been like 50 to 75 pounds. And it is terrible. And that's where all these issues with these transcritical racks come in. And we're going to talk about that further in a little bit. So this whole thing, I mean, the reason we are dropping the pressure down is we need to recondense that CO2 back into a liquid. Now, this is where it gets kind of like hard to understand for a minute. So normally when you reduce your pressure, you're going to have flashing. So what we're doing, so say we're at 1,300 pounds on the condenser side of the high pressure valve. We're now going to drop that pressure down to 500 pounds, which is roughly like a 33 to 34 degree condensing pressure. So we're going to drop that pressure. Now, here's the problem. Normally when you drop your pressure, you're going to flash. So what we're going to do is now we're bringing that CO2 back down to where it's going to be a liquid again. It's back down to below transcritical. That receiver or flash tank is going to be cold. It's going to be 33 degrees, 34 degrees, whatever that pressure setting is, that temperature, it's going to be very cold. So what ends up happening is, so we're drawing vapor off the top of that tank. So we're causing that refrigerant to get cold, that CO2 to get cold. So as that vapor drops into that tank from the flash gas bypass valve, it's condensing back into a liquid. Now it's a very poor and unstable liquid. You're not going to have very much subcooling, maybe a degree, maybe 2 if you're lucky. It's going to be a liquid. But remember, we're coming out of a receiver. So, I mean, if we don't have very much subcooling, it's fine because we're going to be maintaining a solid common liquid out of the receiver. Go ahead, Brett.
So is it safe to say it's comparable? Like if you had a recovery cylinder, right, and you accidentally, hooked up to the wrong side, let's just say the vapor side, and you started pulling vapor off the top, basically it's doing the same thing as what a flash tank is. Basically, you're pulling the vapor off the top, which is dropping the pressure, which is making the remainder of the liquid that's actually in the flash tank or / receiver, making that extremely cold, and then dropping it down in temperature so you have a nice, cold, stable liquid going out to all your cases, correct?
Correct. And I mean, if you really thought about it, using your analogy, if you took, warm discharge gas and injected it into that tank, that warm discharge gas would then, flash into a liquid. It would condense into a liquid because that tank is now cold and that discharge gas is warm. It's going to drop pressure and it's going to condense into a liquid because that tank is cold. So that's how we're making liquid again. So that's how this whole phase change happens. Now, that is the hardest thing for guys to understand. Now, once that has happened, you want to keep that liquid very steady, pressure very steady. Now, that is the most important thing on anything. Like if that receiver pressure or flash tank pressure is not steady, the whole rack runs terrible. From compressor cycling, oil issues, everything. That is the single most important part of this whole system. If either one of those two valves dies, you're done. You're not going to be able to run. So I like to keep spare parts on site, especially those two valves, a driver for each of them. You lose one of those, you're in big trouble. So go ahead, Brett.
They do use a magnet for those valves that you can manually, turn those one way or another. So you could just sit there and turn it for the next couple of hours until you get the right valve. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, it's going to change because that high pressure set point is constantly changing. If you see a high pressure valve that's hunting like all over the place, like 10 to 30% to 60% all over the place, I mean, they should be pretty steady. I mean, there's something wrong. Like you got fan issues. A big thing we see is the temp sensor for the 326A. So the way the 326A has a temp sensor on the outlet of the condenser. It should be on the drop of the condenser, 6 inches from the outlet, insulated. You want it as close to the condenser as possible. So you want it to be insulated. Now that 326A also has a drop leg pressure transducer. So that's going to be driving the subcooling value for the actual high pressure valve. And then you're going to have a receiver pressure transducer that's going to be driving the value for the flash tank. And then all the
bypass, right?
The flash tank bypass valve. So it's going to be setting that. And then there's a bunch of parameters in the 326A controller, which all the stock settings are absolutely terrible, absolutely horrible. I keep saying it again. Like if you see more than like 10-pound swings, your stuff's not tuned. And it needs some tuning.
And that's another thing. We've talked about this before with cascade racks, and even like the the liquid overfeed. If you have uneven loads on any of these types of racks, it just doesn't work well. You have cycling and hunting on all these different types of valves, which is basically going to make like Kevin said, if they're not in tune and everything's running smooth, you're going to have erratic pressures. Lots of cycling as well. One of the racks I was working on that was transcritical up in Oklahoma, I saw 486 cycles on the compressor, and there's no way in hell it ever should have done that. But basically, it was because the VFD wasn't set low enough, and basically it would go to whatever minimum position it was set for, and then basically, nope, not low enough. Then it would have to drop a compressor.
Yeah, so
bring on another. That's due to loading issue.
Yeah, load management is like key with this. So after we come out of that flash tank, now we're going to come out, and depending on the rack manufacturer, like I've seen this multiple different ways. Hill Phoenix uses a strainer on the outlet of liquid. I absolutely hate that. If you're doing a brand new store and you have the Hill set up, they don't put a valve on the outlet of the strainer. Please do everybody a favor and put a valve on the outlet of the strainer, because if it's not there, and that strainer plugs up, it's real fine. You have to blow the entire store down after you pump it down. You have to blow the entire store charge. And you're talking small lines of CO2. That main liquid may only be like 1.125" or 1.3". So you're talking like a $75 ball valve versus like, $900 to, $2,000 worth of CO2 in a bunch of time. So put a ball valve in there for it. Kaiser Warren, Carnot, everybody else, a Hussmann, they put liquid dryers in. I prefer to have liquid dryers in. I think it cleans it up, makes cleanup a lot easier and makes everything a lot easier. I'm not a fan of the strainer. I think it just causes issues. And on those Hillphoenix strainers, there is an O-ring. Do not take that thing apart without the O-ring. I made that mistake once, and when you take it apart, the O-ring swells. So you're pretty much up shit creek. I had to throw it in the freezer for like 30 minutes and let it shrink back down in order to get it to seal. And it still leaked a little bit, but I was able to get it back in. Make sure you have the O-ring for it. Now, once you come out of there, you're gonna go to your cases. Now, when you're feeding your cases, you're gonna have liquid and suction lines like a normal store. Now everything's going to be you're going to have EEVs or pulse valves. Pray to God you don't have pulse valves. I'm not a fan of the pulse valves and CO2. I like that constant, steady superheat that a stepper gives you. Now, with a case, the steppers need tuned. Nothing ever works good with stock settings. You're going to have to tune it. It's just like setting superheat. It's not a just turn the case controller on, let it go. You want to make sure everything's set up right. And then like when you're setting these up, don't ever trust the case manufacturer to put the sensors in the right spot. I don't know how many. The last startup I did, I think we had like 75 sensors in the wrong spots. They had discharge air temp sensors crossed with coil outlet temp sensors. They had sensors crisscrossed everywhere. They had them wired wrong the case controllers. So just, part of startup is you need to check that on every single one and make sure every single transistor is open, because that's a big thing guys miss too, is opening all the transistors. Now, each case controller, you're going to have an EEV in. If you're lucky enough to have the Sporlan EEVs with the removable strainer in there, I mean, you don't need a dryer. If you don't have it and you have one with a strainer inside of it and you have to unsweat it to get to it, you got to put a dryer in front of it. Most of the case manufacturers do it. The nice thing is most of these case manufacturers are putting ball valves on every case, which increases like the price a lot. But I mean, at least you don't have to blow down an entire circuit. Now, if you have to service a case, you only got to blow on that one case. So you got the EV in there, you're maintaining superheat. You could do coil in, coil out. I haven't seen any stores do it up here. I know you guys do it with RDM down there, right? Coil in, coil out.
Yeah, and then like we said before, part of the biggest problem with that is case manufacturers don't know any different, and they basically just put the temperature sensor in between where the EEV is and and the distributor nozzle. But there you're getting a perfect saturated temperature of liquid. You're not really getting a saturated suction. The only way you're going to do that is on the distributor's tubes. But yeah, we've had stores where they come out of the factory and they just don't understand of where they're supposed to be. And like I said, if that line, let's just say for argument's sake is running at 20 degrees in a freezer, the line in between, and basically now it's going to try to control, let's just say an 8-degree superheat. That means it's going to try to maintain 28-degree outlet. But in reality, you might be running a negative 20-degree suction. So basically that case is going to be running at, 30, 40 degrees of superheat and just not work properly.
Yeah. I mean, it's most of our stuff I've always seen is suction temperature or suction pressure with suction saturation and coil outlet temperature controlled. So you want to maintain a tight superheat. Now, here's the problem where it comes in with CO2. So most of these case controllers are going to be controlling temperature and superheat. So meaning they control temperature is their primary driver. Now, when the superheat starts getting low, it's going to start stepping the valve back to control superheat. It's going to take over and it's going to care less about temperature and care more about superheat. Here's where the problem comes in, is you get too many cases stepping back that EEV too much, you start losing mass flow. And when you start losing mass flow, your suction temps come up. And then this is where you start getting oil issues and flow issues and everything else. So this is why it's really important to keep your suction saturation temp up as high as you can keep it. and still you want to float it. That way these EEVs open up more, because now they're not controlling as much case temperature as they are controlling superheat. You want them to control more superheat than case temperature, because you want that steady, constant load back to the rack. When you start getting your saturation temperatures of the CO2, like you're just same as a DX refrigerant, you start getting your saturation temperatures down low, you start having EEV start clamping down, and then you're not getting that mass flow back to the rack, and you start getting compressor cycling, and your whole rack just goes to shit. So you want to keep that saturation temperature up, because most of the time they aren't using EPRs. We have a few stores now where they're actually starting to maintain certain loops at, like, say, like you have a loop of glass doors, and they're trying to maintain that at a 28-degree saturated temp. So they're actually stepping back the main loop, and they're trying to raise the saturation temp up, which is great, because now those EEVs in those cases are controlling suction superheat more than case temperature. They're still controlling case temperature, but your superheat's more constant. Your valve percentages in those cases should be pretty steady. If you look at like a 2-day, 3-day graph of them, they should be pretty steady. You should almost be able to draw a line through them. If you have, 15, 20% swings up and down, that valve's not tuned. You need to tune that valve. And that's what's great about microthermal. Microthermal blows everybody out of the water for CO2. I mean, they've been at it longer than anybody, but like the graphing features on microthermal and the tuning features for the EEVs blow everybody out of the water. Nobody comes close to them. I mean, go ahead, Brett.
You don't like Danfoss at all for CO2 control?
No, I would. I do not like Danfoss the way they do their control, and that 880 controller is like the most frustrating thing to use in the world. But hands down, nobody touches microthermal when it comes to case controllers. Like, they make the best case controller out there. So, I mean, they've been at it the longest for CO2. I mean, to be able to tune everything on there, it works great. Obviously, the stock settings aren't the best, so you're going to have to tune it. Every store is different. I mean, every single case is different. So, like, when you go through and I'm looking at cases doing, add your foods in there. I don't tune cases till there's food in the store, because you want to have a constant load on that thing. Because if you tune cases with no food in the store, you can get it kind of close, but like when there's food in there, you're going to have a higher load in the case, and it's going to throw off everything. So you want to set your base EEV percentages off what that case averages. So like if that case average is open, the EEV is open like 35%, I'm going to set my base open at that. So that way it's only going to let it go a little bit higher than that, but it's going to try to maintain it at 35%. It's where the sweet spot is. That's a great advantage to microthermal. Emerson case controllers leave a lot to be desired. Well, they're Dixel stuff. Lot to be desired for with that. Like, I mean, the interface isn't as great, but I mean, microthermal hands down does great with that.
Yeah, but don't act like they're incapable of being programmed or tuned. I mean, you could
do it. It just takes way longer.
Well, I mean, like I said it before, though, like, I mean, as long as if you have a 5-door programmed one way, you can basically use that as a template and do every other 5-door like that. That's at the same temperature, obviously. Same thing with the 3-door. And it all comes down. Part of the thing that I think it comes down to, all these electronic expansion valves are basically oversized. Like, if you actually do the sizing for them, Sporlan makes a great product, but the only problem is that they don't have an SCR, AAA, which, covers a lot of the capacity of a lot of these 5 doors and 3 doors and stuff. So basically all these valves essentially are oversized. If the startup guy doesn't know what he's doing and basically, it's good, it's fine, we're getting out of here, it's running, you're going to have that valve go from 0 to 100, 0 to 100, constantly just hunting and starving and hunting, just flooding and starving. And if you don't take the time to do that, once again, it goes back to, what we were talking about before, as far as tweaking everything and making everything run smoothly. If we don't do that, it's everything else is going to end up, overcycling. a lot of times, we don't get paid when we take over a store. We don't get paid to tune everything, right? The tuning should have been done from conception when the unit was actually started up. But if I start seeing, valve failures, consistently, hey, this 5-door just went down this week. 2 weeks later, another one goes down. Okay, well, it looks like I got to spend some time and start, checking everything.
Yeah, I mean, usually when we take over a store, like a CO2 store from another contractor, it's usually in shambles, or it depends. I mean, or B, I'm going to say just about 90% of the time they're not tuned, because nobody wants to put the time in the startup and actually tune them. And they got the stock settings in there, and that's where all these issues come in. So yeah, like you said, like that AAA valve not being there is a huge issue, because like a lot of CO2 stores are using glass doors for all the multi-decks. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, some of these cases have almost no load. So you end up with oversized valves. Now, if you're like on a Carnot store, like we have some Carnot warehouses, I have 6-ton coils with 30-ton valves. They oversize their valves on purpose. And I'll tell you what, they run perfect. They control them perfectly.
Is that because of the driver that they have, or is it the type of valve they have in there?
It's just using microthermal. Like they're able to use the PIDs and the minimum valve percentages, and they're able to control that. The reason they oversize their valves is because of the way they do their hot gas defrost. But they're still able to do it.
Hey guys, I want to take a break and talk about Westermeyer, one of our other sponsors. Today's episode is sponsored by Westermeyer Industries, the leader in oil management and pressure vessels for the commercial refrigeration industry. Well, that's one of the things. So we were talking about, tuning a lot of these case controllers, and I've had to tune, CoreLink. I've had to try to tune RDM. I've tried to, tune Emerson, Dixell. I mean, there's so many numbers that you have to adjust. And, I was amazed when, we took over one of our first stores that had the S3C. Like, I saw all these Husband cases that basically have 2,900 BTUs, right? So, they have the SER, double A's, which are basically, depending on the temperature, depending on the day, might be a 1.25 ton valve. And those things can, like, their algorithm that they have in those case controllers is amazing. There's no tuning that you have to do on those at all.
Which those are almost derived from microthermal.
Correct.
So that's where that whole algorithm comes in and everything else. I mean, so they got a good thing going. SC3 and that microthermal controller run great. I mean, you could tune them all. I mean, the only thing that sucks about all this is everybody's settings are different. As an industry, I wish they would get together and they would kind of standardize PID loops and stuff, because, Emerson's PID loop, the higher you go, may be faster. In Dixell's PID loop, the higher the number, the slower it goes. And then Microthermal's PID loop, with one system, it's one way. With another controller, it's a different way. So that's the thing. It kind of sucks for us. I mean, you're trying to tune all these, and I understand why startup guys don't do it. A lot of guys, because they don't know. I mean, most guys don't know how to tune PID loops. I'm still learning how to tune PID loops, but everybody's stuff is different. So that's where it becomes difficult. But that case tuning is a huge thing. So that comes to that rack running efficiently. Now, we're going to go back to the rack. Now, our suction vapor is coming back to the rack. We're going to come in the accumulator on a medium temp, and then you're going to go to your compressors. So this rack is a booster rack. So you're discharging out of your low temp compressors into your medium temp header, out of your medium temp compressors up to the gas cooler. From the gas cooler, you hit the high pressure valve. The high pressure valve is going to cause you to hold back and flash into a liquid, back into a liquid in the flash tank. As you reduce pressure, you vent off the top of the flash tank into the medium temp suction, and that is how we're making CO2 again. Now, your lead compressor on your medium temp should be VFD controlled. I've never seen one that has not been VFD controlled yet. For the medium temp, you want to keep that VFD, you want to keep that suction pressure pretty steady. So you need that VFD control to keep that happening. So your lead is usually VFD controlled. Bitzer or Copeland. We have a couple Bitzer or Copeland racks up here, but most of our stuff has been Bitzer. So you're going to have a VFD on there, and that's going to be varying your compressor capacity. Anywhere from 25 hertz. I've seen them go up to like 65 or 70. They aren't overdriving them much. But that VFD is going to keep your cycling. And then your other compressors are going to be fixed speed. I just seen the first rack the other day with a unloader on a Bitzer. So that is a great advantage because that's been a thing. It's been an issue is, getting some unloaders on some compressors also. So we don't have as much cycling and we can kind of control the load a little better because you don't want that VFD hunting either. Because once that VFD starts hunting, you're going to have issues too.
So when starting up the CO2 booster, I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, you'd have to start the medium temp first, correct?
So yes, well, you could start the low temp, and it's going to cause the medium temp to come on.
Okay.
So they're locked most of the time, and the controls, the low temp won't come on until the medium temp is running. So they're either mechanically interlocked or they're interlocked in the controls. But the medium temp is going to start first. So you're going to start your medium temp first, and then your low temp will come on afterwards, after like a short delay.
So you can run. So if God forbid you would have a problem with the low temp, the medium temp would still run, but not vice versa.
Correct. So otherwise, you're going to blow your relief on your medium temp suction header. So, yeah. Or you're going to trip out the high pressure switches on the low temp. Hopefully, you should trip out the high pressure switches on the low temp before you blow the relief.
So pressure switches are set for what? For the medium temp high pressure and the low temp high pressure.
So low temp high pressure depends on design. I've seen them set 500, 550. It depends on what the medium temp relief set at. So I've seen the Cardinal stores we run 500-pound discharges on the low temp. So those ones are set at like 625.
So what would you say the average pressure that you would be, like on regular HFC racks, right? We're looking usually 125 degrees saturated for EMS cutout and 130 degrees saturated for the high pressure cutout. So pressure difference, saturated difference, what, basically from high pressure limit to, high pressure switch, what are we looking at?
So it has less to do with that. It has more to do with the relief design and that relief capacity. So
okay,
whatever
so
that
how many pounds relief?
Usually I see them set like 550 to 600 pounds on the low temp. So that's what they're set at. If they are manually reset, get rid of them and put them autos. You're going to make your life so much better.
Really?
Yes, because anytime that rack shuts down, say there was an emergency stop situation, something shut the rack down, they had a power glitch, those compressors are going to trip off.
So you're talking probably about what, maybe anywhere from a 50 to a 75-pound difference from the actual relief to the actual high pressure switch. Would that be
That's about right. Yeah.
Okay.
But you want to make most of them have been I see as Danfoss on the low temp is going to be Danfoss high pressure switches like you would see on an HFC system.
Yeah.
It's a standard Danfoss single pole double throw switch. You could make those manual reset Danfoss controls. If you pop a tab in them, you can make them auto reset.
Yeah.
So you want auto reset controls on the low temp because if you have any power glitch, say you lose power for 2 hours and it's cold enough and the rack doesn't blow any reliefs, it'll start back up on its own. Now, if those two compressors are tripped, it's not going to. You're going to start the medium temp up, but your low temp's not going to run. So you want the auto resets. On the high pressure, it could be anywhere from 1,500 to 1,600 pounds. Now, here's the deal with these. Most of them are Emerson PCS or the black encapsulated ones.
Yeah.
I think they're PCSs. Their trip points have been kind of like all over the place. So you could have one that trips out. Like we've had stores where they were tripping out like 1,200 pounds. They were reading off. So we had issues with them, and they're supposed to trip out like 1,600 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
They're tripping out like 1,200 pounds. Now, the only way to get them to reset is they got like a 100-pound swing on the reset. So it's like anywhere from like 75 to 100-pound swing on the reset. So you may have to shut the entire rack down in order to get that compressor to reset. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, so that's going to be your high pressure switches for your actual TC side is going to be anywhere from 1,500 to 1,600 pounds, depending on design. So that's one thing just like keep in mind. Now, you're going to have, obviously, EMS is going to hopefully trip off before that. So the whole goal here is to have the EMS shut everything down before those happen. But if you're in a shutdown situation, those are going to be the things that are keep you from running. Now, let's go over the oil system real quick. So everybody does their oil system a little differently. Everybody has their own nuances with it. So you're going to have a coalescent separator no matter what. Westermeyer, Temp, you're going to have a coalescent separator. So you're going to have a filter separator in there. It's going to cause the CO2 to atomize and drop down, or the CO2 is going to drop out, and the liquid oil is going to drop down to the bottom. You could have an oil eye at the bottom of this separator. Once it sees a level, it'll energize the solenoid coil and it'll bleed out into a reservoir. So like a needle in a float, it's going to be energizing a solenoid, just like the ball in the float will be lifting up and bleeding oil out. Now you're going to go to a reservoir. Hussmann and LMP do it a little bit differently. They have a pressure reducing valve going to the reservoir from the high pressure separator into the reservoir. They set it like 550 pounds, and it's constantly bleeding pressure out. I think it works a little better because you're constantly bleeding pressure out and constantly getting any little bit of oil out of the bottom. You don't have the oil eye to deal with. So what happens? Go ahead, Brett.
So the pressure difference. So I'm assuming. So you're saying about 550. You said, yeah.
Yeah, it's about that. So
okay. So
let me get this from here real quick. Most of these reservoirs are vented to the flash tank. So your flash tank. So you always have flash tank pressure on there. So you're always going to be 500 pounds, say on your flash tank, depending 500 to 600 pounds, depending on the store design. That's going to set your minimum oil pressure.
All right. So basically, if your suction's running on your medium temp 400, 450, then you're going to have about 150 pound pressure difference to get that oil in there. And then on the low temp side, you're going to have potentially almost 350 pounds of pressure of oil going into the low temp, because you should be maintaining about 210, 215, 220, somewhere in that wheelhouse.
Yep, exactly. Now, here's where the problem comes in when I say this flash tank is the most critical part of the system. Mm. So since that oil reservoir is venting to the flash tank to keep constant pressure on there, if that flash tank pressure is swinging all over the place, now your oil reservoir is swinging all over the place. So just like that problem you had today with that OCV at that store, the same thing is happening. Because now you have, so say you have, like, I've seen systems with 90-pound swings on them. So it says set points 500 pounds. I've seen it go from 520 all the way down to like 450. And say your suction temp on your suction pressure is running 430, 450. You're only going to have like 20, 30 pounds of pressure to go in those compressors, and it ain't going to happen. That oil's real thick.
So that means you're not getting shit to your medium temp compressors. Your low temp compressors won't starve out of oil, but your medium temp definitely will. Minimum oil differential for CO2 for the booster. What are you looking for?
50 to 80 pounds. It seems like when they get lower than that, they don't feed that great. it won't move the oil that great, and you'll get, depending on the system. So if you're using Microthermal's oil system, they're using oil eyes inside the compressors, and they're actually looking at the compressor oil level, and there is a solenoid that's going to inject oil into the compressor. So they have a little oil eye in there, and it's looking, when it sees no oil in the compressor, it's going to go through this injection setup, and it's going to, you know, pulse that solenoid on for like so many seconds and off so many seconds, on so many seconds, off so many seconds, and it's going to pulse that solenoid in order to inject in there. Now, after it pulses so many times and it doesn't see that oil level rise up, it's going to lock the compressor out. It'll sit for a little bit, and then it may turn it back on, depending on how it's set up, and it's going to go through the injection process all over again. And if it doesn't feed, it's going to hard lock out. Not the biggest fan of that. It works, but the problem comes in is now you have a lot more moving parts, and you have a lot of programming to go behind that, and that gets people messed up. And you end up with these oil eyes that fail. I mean, we've had a bunch fail, and they just wipe out compressors, because if they fail and they fail full, they say they're full, it'll run that compressor till it's dead.
So those oil sensors, you know, I know Michael Squires posted some pictures where, you know, basically it had some sort of debris inside those sensors, and basically, you know, that's what would cause it to either, you know, fail one way or another. Because I'm assuming are they optic sensors, or are they continuity sensors where it's actually sensing the continuity of the oil?
They are optic sensors. So they're looking at the actual oil in there.
And basically it's feeding off of a, like I've seen the one I saw that basically had an oil header, and basically whenever the oil you know, needed to feed, it basically powered up that solenoid off of that header and then delivered the oil into there. Yeah.
Correct. And those, just a heads up, those solenoids have, you could take the stem off, you could take the nut off, and those solenoids have screens in them, and they do plug up quite often. Now, that was like what everybody was using. They were doing the same thing with CPC, except you're using flexible combiners, which got really confusing for guys. You would have multiple flexible combiners running the oil system. So it's doing the same thing as look at the oil eyes, and it was pulsing the solenoids on. Not the greatest setup, but it works. Now everything is going over to Emerson's new high pressure oil systems. Emerson came out with the OMC line for low temp, which is replacing the OMBs in a sense. And then they came out with a high pressure track. They're calling it a TRAX now, a high pressure TRAX system. So meaning it could take straight transcritical TC pressure and oil and control it. And it works great. So now you're taking all this programming and all these oil solenoids out, and now you have a self-contained control that's doing all your oil management, your alarm, your injection, your compressor safety, all of that on one oil management system now. So we have a couple racks with them. They're working great. The low temp, you may see OMBs on them, depending if it is, because you're running 450 pounds, 500 pounds on it. It can take that pressure for the low temp. But on the medium temp TC side compressors, you need that high pressure oil controller. So those have been working out like really well. But that flash tank pressure, setting that minimum oil pressure is key. If your flash tank's swinging, I guarantee you got oil issues.
Now, do they have any way to communicate with the EMS to let you know when they do have an oil issue, or is it just like a close set of contacts?
So it's going to be just like the OMB was. It's going to have that alarm contact in there. The only thing that it kind of sucks is you lose when this whole thing is happening. When you're using like the optic eye, you could grade your pulses or record your pulses a day on that compressor. So you could see if, say, compressor 1, 2, and 3, compressor 1's got 300 pulses a day. Compressor 2 has like 100 pulses a day. well, compressor one's using way more oil. Why is compressor one using more oil? Is there an issue with compressor one? Is it wear? Is it getting some more flood back? Is there an issue with the oil optic eye? So you lose that data. That's the only thing I don't like about it. You lose that data of it pulsing.
So if regular compressor, regular CO2 compressor, if you're talking pulses, per hour, what would you expect, for that compressor to basically pulse, how many times per hour? What would you expect from normal operation with steady pressures?
It varies on the store, anywhere from low temps usually seem to be pulse more. So maybe like 20 to 50 pulses, maybe less, maybe 20 on a really good tuned store. Medium temp depends on if you have a low temp separator. Some stores use a low temp separator. It's not very common, but medium temp, if you got a good running store, maybe, and you're not transcritical, maybe 20 pulses an hour. I mean, if you're running transcritical, you're moving way more oil. Your mass flow is increased exponentially, and you're moving way more oil. You may see them at 50 pulses an hour. If I see flood back, I've seen them at 100 pulses an hour. You see them just it's moving extreme amounts of oil.
So probably the reason why, when you were talking about being transcritical, because you stated before that basically you're not in a liquid form. You're not in a liquid state. There's no subcooling going on. So if there's no liquid in that gas cooler, then basically you have less resistance in that gas cooler. So the gas is just flying through there. So the velocity is just picked up exponentially. Yeah.
Yeah, we've had issues with the oil separators themselves, with the ones that have an optical eye in them and they pulse when it gets high enough. We've actually gone to the point where we were pulsing like every 2 minutes for like 20, 30 seconds, no matter if there was oil in the eye or not, because what was happening when it was getting transcritical, we were getting so much velocity in there. The theory was here, which I believe it to be true, it was causing the oil to get picked up in the bottom of the separator and pulled back out to the system. So we started, when we go transcritical, we start pulsing that solenoid even more, whether it's calling for oil or not. I mean, you see the oil issues, but I mean, generally, if you tune this system, your oil issues go away. I mean, you want to make sure the temp right's clean, obviously, and make sure the temp right is not blown. But
same pressure difference, like with a regular HFC, CFC refrigerant. 13 is the danger zone. Change out the damn separator. 15 is when it's typically going to blow out. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never really seen more than like a 2 pound drop on them. Usually they're either blown or not blown.
Gotcha.
I mean, have you ever seen a separator with like a 13 or 15 pound drop? I really haven't.
Yeah, when we had that talk with Adam, I've seen where basically the separator was just chock full. It was just chock full of oil, and basically the oversaturation of the shitty oil just basically caused that high of a differential. But it would only present itself whenever like you had more of your compressors running. Let's just say there's 6 compressors on the rack. You had 3 compressors running, maybe running at 6 pounds. Then all of a sudden it shoots up to 12, 13 whenever the rest of the compressors come on after a big load come on.
Yeah, I mean it's generally when I get there, it's usually blowing my luck. But that is the how most of the oil systems are. I mean, you have some stores where they we talked about that pressure reducing valve. Now that valve, all it's doing is just constantly bleeding oil out of the bottom of the separator, always out of the bottom of the separator into the reservoir. Then the reservoir vents off to the flash tank. The problem with that side is it's not efficient, because now you're always bleeding pressure from the discharge to your suction, but you get the oil out.
So basically, it's going to be an outlet pressure regulator, right? What type of valve do they typically use?
It's a hydraulic valve. I have no idea where this valve comes from, but it's got hydraulic numbers all over it, and that's how it's. I mean, plain and simple. I mean, they're taking parts for these CO2 racks, and a lot of it comes from hydraulics. I mean, because they're rated for the pressure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, oil filters we generally don't have. Everything's just going to be using the temp right. And then the one thing I want to go over: Hill Phoenix does not put liquid cores on their liquid, so they have the strainer. Now, what they do is they put in a suction shell with a liquid core in it. So they're actually filtering the low temp suction, and that's how they're doing their filtering on it. They're filtering the low temp suction coming back from the store.
Which I guess would make sense because they want to make sure nothing really hits those compressors. But then you have the downfall of not actually filtering anything before it actually heads out to the liquid side. Besides like you said, like the regular the strainer that they have in that particular line. Anything special with obviously well, I mean you're dealing with flash tank pressures for the liquid side. So basically a regular standard core should basically work, yeah, because I mean basically it's 515 up to 600. So I mean that's 410A pressures on a 140-degree day. So I mean you should be straight.
Yeah, pretty much everything with CO2, like you're going to see it in most grocery store applications, are everything on the other side of the high pressure valve is going to be 410A pressures. Yeah, everything in your case is going to be like 410A stuff. Not exact 410A pressures, but you're going to be running those like 410A style pressures. So you could use your normal like probes or like a set of gauges, a high pressure gauge. I use probes in there. I use my Sporlan probes in there because they're good 800 pounds. The field piece probes, same thing. That's what I tend to use in there. You're not going to damage them. Most of those things are good 800 pounds. So that's what you use. So I think we're going to wrap up for the first episode. We'll wrap it up here. And then next week, we'll get into a little bit of injectors. And then I want to go over defrost. And then we're going to spend the rest of that time going over like servicing, what to look for when you get to a store, how to kind of tune these a little bit. We'll go into a little bit of tuning and then some more service type stuff. So thanks for listening, guys. Have a nice night.
Yeah, guys. Thank you so much.